Well, welcome everybody to Pastor and the Recovering Heretic. I'm the pastor, sometimes recovering heretic, and with us is Dan.
The always recovering heretic.
Yeah.
Or always heretic, sometimes recovering?
We'll
always
always recovering.
yeah.
I like that one. Yeah. But welcome. As a quick reminder, you can chat to us. We're happy to be interrupted, and so ask your questions at any point. Ask your questions, and so here we are. Welcome, Dan.
Welcome. And then, here's the big thing. You know, our theme today.
Yeah.
I don't know how long this will last, but we'll see.
There we go.
But it is the fashion of the Bible. And it stood out precisely because of today's readings.
Yeah.
There are two passages that got me thinking about clothes.
Right, yeah.
And first and foremost, it's Transfiguration Sunday.
Yeah.
And they do make a big deal in today's gospel. Mark makes a big deal about the fact that Jesus' clothes, to borrow from marketing campaigns, they were the whitest whites, the cleanest clean.
Right.
They were dazzlingly white,
Yeah.
you know, and I'm surprised Clorox hasn't taken today's gospel reading and used it in their marketing campaigns.
Yeah.
But
it's a missed opportunity.
Yeah.
Clorox, we're willing to accept royalty campaigns here at Resurrection Lutheran Church.
So let's start with the fact that they do make a big deal about the clothes becoming so white.
Yeah.
Why is that a big deal? Was it because people couldn't wash their clothes much? Did Jesus in particular wear dingy clothes?
Certain colors are actually hard to get in the ancient world. Whites, purples, reds, they're actually expensive colors.
Okay.
And so that's a huge part of it, is just, this is not a common, just as purple is not a common color,
That's why it was the color of royalty.
Right,
Such a rare
right.
dye.
The emperor, was purple, and it was very messy to get, and white is another color that's not very common or as common, and so, that's a huge part of it. Is the cost of that color.
Yeah.
Another part of it is just bright, shining light. Is it's one of those indicators of like direct presence of God.
Yeah.
Thunder, fire, lightning, and bright white lights. These are Bible key, like big flashing hint, hint, hint. God is right here.
Yeah.
Figure it out. That's another part of it. As to clothing, Jesus probably wore a tunic, and a tunic is kind of, imagine a poncho that's closed instead of open, and got
has the seams shut.
it has the seams up the side shut, and has holes for your arm, for your head, and for your two legs. Not for both, but just one. It's more like a dress, really. Just a giant hole at the bottom for your legs. Came down to about your knees.
Okay. Well, and that's again enlightening in and of itself, because the stereotypical paintings of Jesus, he's wearing it's robes, they're ankle length,
flowing,
and that never seemed Jesus being itinerant, always wandering around. That's not ideal for hiking from town to town.
No, right. Right, the long flowing robes.
Yeah.
No, I mean, it's an inglorious garment. You can make it out of your own bed sheets, at home if you want one. Like it's not a great looking thing.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's what it's all about.
So he probably wore a tunic, not the robes. Knee length. What about footwear? Would he have gone barefoot? Was he wearing sandals? Were there closed shoes?
It was probably sandals. It was some form of sandal. Some form of leather sandal, basically. Yeah.
And what about going back further then? So he wore a tunic in his ministry periods while he's going from town to town. When he labored with Joseph, and we've talked about this earlier, that the image of him, Joseph being a woodworking carpenter like we think of it today, was off, that it was probably basically a day laborer doing heavy labor, hauling massive stone blocks for
for building the temple.
For Herod's newest
city
construction project.
Yeah.
So would a tunic, would Jesus and Joseph, as Jesus is working side by side with Joseph growing up, and in his 20s, would they have worn that tunic?
Yeah.
Or as laborers, would they have worn something else?
Yeah, I mean, it's not like our world where like there's multiple variations of clothing. You know, he probably had one or two tunics.
And that was the wardrobe. That's all you had.
And that was the wardrobe, right. Yeah. So it wasn't, I have 15 tunics, all organized by color scheme. You know, like it was, I have very little possessions. You know, Jesus' own words are, the Son of Man has no place to lay his head. You know, and so he's homeless, right? He wears what he's got, effectively.
So that's how he would have traveled. And that's the other question. Would he have had luggage with him, or
No.
he just traveled with literally the tunic on his back?
What he had. The disciples have a common purse, they call it. It's very clear. Judas manages it, actually. So there's obviously some kind of group funding, you know, but right, it's not, they have what they have and they go where they go. And that's about it.
Yeah. So they are literally, I mean, they're the one gospel scene, and gets Jesus in trouble because they're picking grain as they're walking through a field to eat.
Yes.
On the Sabbath.
On the Sabbath, yes.
But so they didn't even carry food with them. They just had to beg and
Right.
scavenge as they went.
Right. They were gleaners, you know, like the poor of the poor. Yeah.
So that's where I guess the Franciscans get all that.
Yep. Franciscans are just following the model. It wasn't uncommon for great teachers in the ancient world. The Greek and Roman world has my favorite character ever, and that's the begging philosopher. And this would be a guy who would, the panhandling philosopher. He would shout teaching at you in the marketplace. And then he would tell you, I taught you, now give me money. You know? And so this is actually what got Paul so concerned. Every time Paul talks about I didn't take money, Paul's trying to actually separate himself from these people.
Oh, that's where that line comes from.
Yeah, that's why Paul's so concerned about talking about how he doesn't take money. Because Paul's he's a leather worker, he's a tent maker, you know, literally. And so, but Paul brings that up all the time because he's trying to point out, I'm not like these panhandling philosophers that you all encounter literally all over the place, you know, who spout off bits of Plato and then say, I made you wise, give me money. You know, I would have loved, I want to be one.
Yeah, Kate's saying that we should bring back the begging philosopher.
Right.
If that's her new career goal. But,
right, exactly. You can shout at the man standing in downtown Hilliard, shouting at people, you know, philosophical truth, and saying, "Give me $5 now." Yeah. So
we'll expand your mind for 5 cents.
Yeah, exactly. We'll expand, and so. That's also behind Jesus' instruction, take nothing with you, have it all provided for you as you go.
Yeah.
You know, that's what he says to the disciples, just take nothing, take no provision with you. You know, it's kind of all to, there was a kind of person in the ancient world who was trying to make money off enlightenment. And the early Christian movement tried to separate themselves from that in various ways. So Paul is very clear to say, I have my own profession, you know, I pay my way.
Yeah.
Jesus tells the disciples, just accept whatever's given to you out of charity. You know, don't ask, don't bother. Just, you know, whatever's provided for you is provided, and go. You know, but it's all about trying to separate yourself from this very common character who is kind of a huckster, pitching enlightenment or secret knowledge. You know, in order to make money off it.
Well, that brings up a question. I actually had this a couple of weeks ago when they were talking about, as Jesus is performing his first miracles, and, you know, they say, the Galileans were all impressed, and they spread the word.
Yeah.
But back in those days, a miracle worker was another profession. There were huckster miracle workers.
Yeah.
And so what was it, since they were used to seeing miracle workers running around towns all the time, why did Jesus stand out? What was it about his miracles that were different from the miracle workers' miracles?
Yeah.
So that they would have gotten excited, and they didn't get excited about the other people.
So part of it is they don't really well, in the book of Acts at least, this is actually the exact argument the Jewish leaders make, at first, is when they're arguing about what to do about Christians, one of them says, well, just wait it out. If it's real, you won't be able to stop it because it's real. If it's not, just, it'll die out because it's a fraud. And so in a certain way they couldn't. It was just sheer length of time, that it kept going that kind of proved its own.
Gotcha.
The other thing is that they're real, right? There's a difference between the huckster miracle worker, the snake oil salesman, the placebo effect, whatever you want to call it, and real, honest to God, miracles. And on top of that, Jesus wasn't, the miracle was always toward an end, so usually it's liberation or restoration to community, and so it's not just that he heals somebody, but that he restores them it restores them to wholeness in the community, in addition to healing the guy, the person, and so everybody makes a big deal over last week's gospel lesson where he heals Peter's mother-in-law, and then it says, and she got up and she served them, and everybody goes, oh, that's awful that Jesus heals her. The first thing she has to do is make everybody dinner, and it's not great, and we wouldn't do it today, but the point there is that she's restored back to proper community. She's restored back to whole community, so Jesus' healing campaigns aren't just about a miracle worker is out just to heal people for money's sake, usually. Jesus is healing.
So I'll raise your father-in-law from the dead for $50.
Right, for $50. Right.
Okay.
Jesus' healing is toward liberation, in some way. And so there's again, he's out on a direct action campaign, and so his healing is toward poking the powerful in the eye and restoring people, restoring the powerless, back to wholeness, both physically but also communally.
Now, is that why? And this scene has always stood out. He gets a little cheesed off, and I don't remember which gospel it's in, but this woman, as he's walking by, and she reaches out and touches his garments, and is healed of whatever, but he notices, in fact, it says he feels the power drain from him.
Right.
And he looks at her, and he's cheesed off that she did that.
He's a little annoyed at first, right? Well, that's kind of the origin of that. It's he's on a direct action campaign, and so this healing's going to serve a purpose, and the guy he's going to, but even then, that turns into its own lesson, too, right? Because that woman has hemorrhages, she's probably got some bleeding disorder of some kind, and so by law she's exiled because she's by nature unclean, but she's healed, she's restored to wholeness. It's not just about you're made well again, it's about here's this powerless woman who's the lowest of the low, and she is restored to proper community. And so...
And maybe the lesson is kind of a Luther lesson, even though she didn't do it right,
the
right way.
Right, even though she didn't do it the right way, this is what Jesus does. Just trusting that even his cloak will do this to you, brings you this liberation. And so a huge part of what separates a Jesus from a normal miracle worker is that Jesus has he's on this extended campaign to... as Mary sings before Jesus is born, cast the mighty down from their thrones and lift up the lowly, and so his miracles have purpose, to them. That's true to today, if you're talking about miracles in your own life. What separates God from a genie is that miracles have God's healing, God's miraculous power has purpose to it. It serves a greater sign, whether it's greater conversion or liberation, or that's where miracles come. They don't, a genie just heals you because you wish for it.
And a lot of times it seems like genie tales are based in materialism too.
Right.
Fabulous wealth.
Right. Give me fabulous wealth, and God absolutely does miracles, but miracles exist to point you to something, and to make a greater point about the glory of God, And so
it's still about making you a better person in one way or another.
yeah, and making society better, and again, liberation's the key word, right? Like actually bringing about the real liberating freedom of God. Excuse me.
No problem.
So,
I want to get back to this then, back to the clothing issue, because we brought women up, touching Jesus's tunic healed this woman. Talked about Mary again. What would women have been wearing? Would they have also just worn a tunic?
Yeah,
it seems like head coverings are big, at least in the paintings. Was that true too?
Yeah, so it's a tunic again. Right.
So again, not the robes that we see in the paintings.
Yeah, the big floor. I mean, you did if you were wealthy like that. Just Jesus wasn't wealthy.
Yeah. In fact, that seems critical. The fact that Jesus lived an impoverished life,
right?
Lived with the people in poverty, grew up with people in poverty,
right. Yeah. So, right. So, other people, yes, sometimes were that way. Yeah, I mean, it's effectively again, it's a tunic. It's a little more dress.
So it's a little cut lower.
Yeah, but it's effectively a similar garment. Poncho sewed up the side with holes at various places. So, yeah.
But would women have worn a head covering as well?
Yeah, so, right. So there is a sense of, yes, you wear a head covering of, there's whether it's something like the Muslim hijab, something like that often, think of what your stereotypical picture of a lot of the Middle East today.
Yeah.
A lot of what we think of as Muslim practices are really Arab Middle Eastern practices, that kind of predate, they're more cultural, they predate Islam even, and so, if you experience Muslims in Africa, they look very different than Muslims in the Middle East, and that's simply because you've got a lot of Middle Eastern custom that's there.
And we associate with
Islam. But really you could associate with a lot of it with Jesus' day too, because it's very ancient custom.
Yeah. Well, it seems like right up to recent memory, I remember as a kid growing up, when I went to church on Sundays.
Yeah, women hats.
Always wore head coverings as well.
Women wore hats, and the hats were beautiful, right?
Yeah.
Similar thing.
If they didn't have a hat, they had a veil over their head.
Right, veil, right. And that's for a certain understanding of what modesty is,
Well, that's the theory behind the hijab too.
Right. It's about modesty, Now it's patriarchal modesty, Nobody ever asked men those questions.
Yeah.
And so it's patriarchal modesty, but in the end it's about modesty, is what they're trying to do.
Well, you mentioned that, there were people who did wear those stereotypical robes, but that was only for the rich. And that brings me to the next big, I don't know if it's fashion, if it's culture question, but if I only have one tunic to my name, why would I rip it apart?
Why would I rip it?
Every time there's an emotional high or low in the Bible, their immediate reaction is to rip their clothes apart.
Right.
And that just, I've got one tunic and I've just ripped it apart. Now what am I going to do?
What am I going to do?
Why did they do that? What was the custom? Or did only the rich rip their clothes apart?
No, that was not. So it has a lot to do with the difference between, we talk about this in Bible study, so forgive me if I repeat myself, but there's a big difference between our culture, which is a guilt culture, and their culture, which is what we call an honor-shame culture. One of the big differences is that honor-shame cultures process everything externally. And so in our world, we tell kids, it doesn't matter what people think of you, It's the exact opposite in an honor-shame culture. In Jesus' culture, it did. That's actually all that mattered. What you thought about yourself
didn't matter.
Was kind of really irrelevant. Yeah. It was what other people ascribed to you. And so part of that is that you process everything publicly, whereas we process everything internally. So an honor shame culture is very quick to public mourning. And you see a video of a suicide bomber happening in the Middle East. I mean, the great masses of mourners. That is partially about being very public with your emotions, because you process very publicly. A lot of African culture is this way too, and so
Greek Stoicism has no role.
Well, I mean, even Stoicism is a response to this, right? Stoicism. You only get Stoicism because there's this very public. Stoicism's basically saying, all these people process all these things externally, be different. It's why it was such an appealing philosophy for so long. It's because it was responding to the cultural milieu of its day. But that's why you don't see modern Stoics, because when we read Stoics, we're kind of like, oh yeah, that's just
how life is.
Yeah, that's just how life is. We read Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, who's a Stoic, and we're kind of like, oh, they're cute little aphorisms, but what he was writing about there is actually pretty revolutionary because what you're feeling is processed publicly, not internally, and so part of that is you rip your garments, you wear sackcloth and ashes, you publicly do these things because that's where you process your emotions, is
in the public square.
In the public.
Yeah, whereas now we look down on you if you.
Yeah, now it's the exact opposite, right? So like a guilt culture, this is where a guilt culture is very different. Guilt culture, it's all internal process, and that's not to say one is better than the other, just there are different ways there's a lot of bad that goes with a guilt culture and a lot of good, and there's a lot of bad that goes with an honor shame society and a lot of good, it's just different ways of being in the world.
Yeah, and Kate points out that it was pretty easy for them to go ahead and rip.
Yeah, one garment's pretty easy to rip, right? I mean,
well, she was also saying, they're also been sewn and resewn so many times from every other time you ripped them.
Right. Apart. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. So that's the other part, right? I mean, you can sew up a single sheet of fabric, and so it's not like this, but you can sew up a single sheet of fabric pretty quickly.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. You don't have to worry about zippers or buttons.
Right, zippers or buttons, right.
And that, when I was researching, just to get a graphic for today's topic in our Facebook post, I saw so many, from archaeological digs, so many representations of different cultures in the Mideast, the biblical Mideast, and what they wore, even contemporaneous with each other, and how varied it was. What struck me very intriguingly was how similar the original Hebraic and Canaanite clothing was to ancient Egyptian. And is that just a byproduct of Egypt having been the dominant force for so long in that region? So their fashion sense?
Yeah, part of it's like weather, it's just warmer, and so you gravitate towards a certain kind of clothing. But yeah, a huge part of it is just, right, Egypt was their colonial power for 2,000 years, and so you gravitate toward that. And all those people are kind of Coptic, which is the kind of like the original Egyptians. Most Egyptians are Arab Egyptians now, but Copts are actually kind of like the original Egyptians.
I didn't realize there was a difference.
No, there's a you talk to Chaldeans also. They're they're Babylonians. Not like there's a lot in Iraq today. There's a lot of Arabs. But Chaldeans are, Babylonians, like original to the place. But all those languages are related because they're all similar peoples.
Yeah.
Even the Canaanites and the Israelites, they fought, but archaeologically,
they're the same.
They're the same people. We can't actually tell a Canaanite site from a Israelite site.
Yeah.
Because they're actually the same people. They have a different religion, but they're the same people,
Yeah. Yeah, that brings up a interesting, I was reading about how people moved about in the ancient cultures.
Yeah.
And it brought that up, that most likely Exodus was kind of Arthurian in that it's based on the fact that, that the people who became the Israelites migrated, but it was a slow migration.
Yeah.
Over time. And again, like you said, because Egypt was this big colonial power.
Right.
So,
well, and there was probably a lot of things going on there. Like, I said this when we did our Exodus study, but like Exodus, the book we have in the Bible is a drama. It's a play, and so I think it's a drama based off a historical event, but that doesn't change the fact that the book we have and the way it's gone about, it's dramatic. It's not aiming to tell pure history. It's aiming to tell a drama,
Right.
And that's
like
why
we were talking about before. It's great Hollywood fodder.
Right, and that's why it's great Hollywood fodder, because it was meant to be, on the dramatic stage, really.
Yeah. Well, it was originally an oral story, right? They
Right.
didn't write it down. It was an oral tradition.
oral story that you told and retold.
So you'd enhance it with the telling.
Right.
To captivate your audience.
Right. So where that leads is that, right, if as described in the book of Exodus, we don't have there's something like 6 million people that'd be leaving if it was word for word as it happened in the book of Exodus. We don't have evidence for 6 million people walking out of Egypt. Was there a kernel of truth of a group of slaves were freed by God, that ended up migrating their way to Canaan? Probably.
Yeah.
I absolutely believe that.
Yeah. But it might have been like 40.
Yeah, well, it might have been a much smaller group.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, and that even brings up the whole, and this is something I've wondered about a lot. Moses, bringing it all the way back, is Egyptian for son of. So we don't even have the full name of that leader.
Right. Yeah.
It's like today, it was Mac.
Right. Yeah, right.
It's like, Mac who?
Right. Mac who? Right. Yeah. Right. Mac truck. Yeah, right. So remember, the Bible has a point, even when it's telling history. It's even at its most historical, it's biased history.
Yeah.
The example I use is King Ahab. Who, if you read the Elijah story, Ahab's like the most evil king there is. In real history, Ahab's king of Israel at the height of Israel's power. Israel defeats Assyria under Ahab.
Which was no mean feat.
Yeah, it's like the superpower of its day. Like Ahab's a brilliant minus the biblical record, Ahab's a brilliant diplomat, a great general, and Israel's most prosperous under him, wealthiest. And so if we didn't have the biblical record, we'd say he's a great king.
Yeah.
He'd be Ahab the Great. But when the Bible tells Ahab's story, the Bible's trying to make a point about Ahab's worship, his faith, and so he's quite evil man, and the Bible's got an agenda, and that doesn't mean it's wrong. I think it's absolutely true about Ahab, but we got to remember then that if you're asking, is it pure history? It's like, well, it's got a point it's trying to make, and toward that point, yes. But
so it's history purely through the lens of this religion.
Yeah, right, exactly.
So you stray from the religion, you're bad no matter how secularly good you are.
Yeah, right. I mean, yes, his unemployment numbers were low, but he worshipped false gods, and he was a cruel man. But the unemployment numbers don't tell you anything about that.
Right.
Whereas the Bible doesn't care about the unemployment numbers. They're different things.
Israel's GDP at the time did not.
It doesn't factor into the historian's perspective.
Well, why with Elijah? It gets us bringing this back to the clothing aspect of things.
Right.
With today's story, Elijah rolls up the mantle, the tunic. It's smacks. Is it seemed like today was like a mini recreation of Moses parting the Red Sea. Was it meant to be that way? Was that what Elijah and Elijah were doing?
Yeah, I would say pretty instinctively that is, or at least water represents chaos, right? So the Red Sea is the biggest example of this, but any time water is parted, it's a statement about God's power.
And he's creating order from that chaos.
Right. Out of pure chaos itself, it can be divided and formed and shaped. And so that's always it's more like parting water displays a point about God. And so that's most on display at the Red Sea, parting the Red Sea, but Jordan parts all the time too for people.
Yeah.
It parts when the people enter the promised land. It parts for Elijah.
Yeah.
It'll part. Read five verses forward. It'll part as Elisha's walking back. It's a statement about God. God parts chaos.
Yeah.
Especially for the sake of His people and His prophets. And so that's as much of what it's a statement about.
Yeah. Although ever since you brought up the fact that the Jordan isn't really exactly a mighty river, but more like a babbling brook.
Yeah.
That's kind of lessened the impact of those scenes.
I know, right? It's not giant walls of water. It's yeah, I know.
Like Mel Brooks in The History of the World.
Yeah, right.
Moses is standing at the puddle,
right?
telling it.
Right. No, I mean that's the other thing about parting Jordan specifically is Jordan is the boundary. On that side is not the promised land. On this side is the promised land. And so there's a sense of in its parting, you're crossing worlds. You are that very much this. It's just a babbling brook, but this babbling brook represents a serious crossing between places.
Yeah. It's almost like it's a dimensional.
Yeah, it's a dimensional portal. Right.
Yeah.
It's a TARDIS.
Yeah.
Like it leads you to another place. Wormhole from Star Trek, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what's happening there. On that side is not God's territory. Is kind of the image.
That's cool.
Yeah.
And we are now out of time.
Okay.
But
Wow.
that was fascinating. I liked our little romp.
Right.
Through ostensibly fashion, but it, as usual, ended up being much.
Ended up being all over the place.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and again, thanks for the feedback, Charlie and Kate. Anybody else, when you have questions, go ahead and put them in the chat box or email Pastor Dave ahead of time. Not sure what we'll be talking about next week. It'll be whatever the readings inspire.
Temptation in the wilderness, I think, is what it is. It's usually temptation in the wilderness first Sunday in Lent.
Okay.
So
maybe we'll talk about fasting or something. We'll see what comes up.
We'll see what comes up. Right.
But yeah, if you have any questions in between, Lent is a good time.
Right.
Ask questions about the tradition of Lent and how they got started.
Yep. Got 40 days, folks.
Yeah. So if you have questions about why we do what we do during Lent, ask them. Let us know. And in the meantime, have a grand week. Hope you enjoy Fat Tuesday.
Yes. Enjoy it.
We'll see you. Bye.
Bye.